Welcome back, everyone. I know the weather may be misleading, but we are rapidly approaching the fall sitting of Parliament. And as a result, we are getting the band back together, starting another season of No Talking Points, iPolitics signature podcast. I am Marc Vigliotti, the editor-in-chief here at iPolitics. I am a co-host alongside our publisher, Brian Storseth, who joins me every week for this show. And today we have two really terrific guests to help us break down all the latest and greatest in Canadian political news. We have Farees Nathoo. He is the Vice President of Strategy and Risk at Enterprise Canada, and Jamie Tronnes, the Executive Director at the Center for North American Prosperity and Security. Thank you both for joining us. What's happened? Everything, seemingly, for the past weekend. And where else can we start other than the trade war? I love that we're now openly calling it a trade war, and it seems like both sides have embraced that language. Jamie, I'll start with you. We seem to be settling in for a protracted fight here. Talks have been suspended. Everyone is throwing insults at each other. We're apparently renaming lakes. If we are going into this long Cold War, at this stage, there's a lot of kind of comments on both sides on terms of who has the leverage in these talks. In your kind of wisdom, who do you think has the advantage to bear out a tough fight or a long fight when it comes to these trade disputes?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about Canada having really punched back a lot harder than the Americans could have possibly expected. And there's one thing that Canada really has going for it in that the entire country is united in this fight. It is very much viewed as an attack on Canada and a betrayal of a friendship of an ally. And because of that, Canadians are really rallying to defend even politically positions that they otherwise might not defend. Here in the U.S., though, we have a view from the White House that Canada doesn't have anything that we need. Canada is obviously smaller than us, therefore we have a lot more leverage. There's more cards at the table for the United States. But really, Canada's been very strategic in how it's fighting back, and that is getting noticed.
Mm-hmm. Freeze, I'll put forward the same question, but just to add, in terms of James' point that Canada is being very smart strategically in this fight, is that a fair read of what you're seeing so far?
Yes, but I think the environment's changing, and I think the environment's changing for me on sort of three zones. So first is timelines, second is kind of the domestic politics on both sides of the border, and the third is on the substance of the response in terms of tariffs themselves. So on dates, I think it's really interesting that Canada's counter tariffs are going to come into effect on the 8th of September, and the president's subsequent retaliatory tariffs on autos are going to come into effect January 1st, 2027. The delta between those leaves the midterm smack dab in the middle of that. And you can sort of think about the period between now and September 8th as like a kind of negotiating overtime, though I don't know, and I don't certainly feel optimistic about the likelihood of that overtime yielding any breakthrough. But I do think it's interesting that we're now talking about a zone where this is spilling over into 2027. And for me, what that spells out is the domestic politics are much more challenging for Trump than Carney, as Jamie really pointed out. The prime minister, he's going to face significant economic headwinds, and that's a key brand differentiator for his competencies versus any of his competition. But I do think that the president, inversely, is sort of, he's going to be threatened by his own unpopularity, and that may prove near fatal in the midterms. On the fiscal front, Canadians do have the power to sustain a response, but not indefinitely, right? We're just talking about two economies that are vastly different scales. And so I don't think that unity and the prime minister's brand strength is going to be a panacea for the Canadian side. My biggest takeaway from the events of the last couple of weeks is that baked-in tariffs cannot be a starting point for the Canadian side. I don't think it's at all acceptable for a Canadian side to accept tariffs being baked in as an interim or long-term solution. That would fundamentally reset the tenor of our trading relationships with our closest trading.
It frees this terrific point. And, it does kind of set up this fascinating dynamic where it's like, who actually has the benefit of time here? Sure, Trump's facing political headwinds at home, but at the same time, Canada can't, even though we're united, certainly that impact to our economy is pretty oversized compared to the impact on the American economy, which is much bigger than ours. But one thing, though, I want to pick up, and Brian, you've made this point a lot, so I want to bring it back to you. If the midterms go as poorly as we're anticipating, and I want to get everyone in after this, are we really going to see a sea change in terms of trade policy? And even if it's not from Trump, we had Gavin Newsom on some of the King networks last night, and he was not saying, well, we're going to repeal these things if the Democrats win the White House. It was a bit more circumspect. So I'm just wondering, Brian, What's your read? Like, can we really expect a win from the midterms, even if the Democrats, bulldoze the Republicans?
I mean, you're looking at, to be clear for our viewers, a huge win for the Democrats in the midterms. Most sources would tell you that's like 51-49 kind of thing. Like, this isn't like Canada where you're looking at much bigger margins, and the differential may be higher in the Congress. But at the end of the day, you're still looking at some pretty tight races and a pretty tight electoral map. I think the way that Canada seems to be targeting the counter tariffs seems very strategic. It's going to have impacts on races in Maine and Alaska, where the Dems are obviously looking to make some pickups. So, yeah, this is an interesting situation that Canada has found itself in. But at the end of the day, no, I think the Democrats might be put a nicer face on it, put a little more, politeness in screwing us over when it comes to the tariffs that are being put in place. But nobody's talking about saying, hey, we don't want those jobs in Michigan, right? We don't want those manufacturing jobs in Ohio. Nobody's saying that. So I think that this is the very beginning of a long stretched out process for Canada. And, Carney, the prime minister, has received a lot of accolades for his response so far. But like, this is, to me, I compare this, maybe poorly so, but I compare this to like a poker hand, and it's a poker game. And he laid his cards down once and didn't go all in once, but we're far from, getting through this. And the one thing I have seen and heard from businesses in this country is that they're already pretty stretched and pretty tapped. We are not competitive when it comes to the taxation system already, and many of these other things that are a little prohibitive in Canada. So these tariffs could have a huge impact over the next few months if they stretch out.
And Jamie, you're on the ground in Washington. What's your read?
Yeah, I mean, there are several Senate places up for play. Iowa, I think, is one I'm keeping an eye on. The counter tariffs that Canada imposed greatly affect the the farm and agricultural manufacturing sector that's based in Iowa. So John Deere, for example, has 4 agricultural plants that they make a variety of different equipment at. And they're not alone. Caterpillar has some, and all of those things are now counter tariffed. This is really important for the Americans. They were already facing some headwinds on steel and aluminum tariffs in that part of the country. The farmers themselves have been hit by tariffs with other countries, notably China. And a lot of the market share that the US used to have isn't coming back. Once you find someone else who will be happy to supply you with soybeans or what have you, it's very easy for that supply chain to be completely changed. And I think that the long-term ramification from some of Trump's tariffs that he imposed in his first term are still being felt by farmers today, who have lost their supply chain and market share. So it's not just the farmers, though. We're seeing in Ohio, people are getting very nervous about what's going on. Michigan, obviously, I think the administration greatly underestimated how much of a factor the Gordie Howe Bridge was, not just for Democrats, but for Republicans who wanted the state of the art technology on homeland security, the cameras, the sensors, the X-ray machines, even the holding cells for criminals that are suspected of transshipments and things like that. They wanted that open, and it was a real strong pressure point for the Republicans to be able to say, we keep asking Canada to secure the border, but at the same time, we're not letting them open up the brand new bridge that they built to secure the border. And this isn't helping us in Michigan. So there's a lot in play. I think the House is a foregone conclusion. It will go Democrat. But why this matters is because we are already seeing the Democrats are starting their strategy for post-midterm investigations of Trump and his officials. We could be in a position where there's an impeachment, a vote in the Senate, and JD Vance has to come down and vote in it as the vice president. We could be looking at ongoing investigations, just things dragging out for the next 2 years into looking into the business dealings of the White House officials, the president, his family, and just having that dominate the headlines. Where does that leave Canada? Well, you have a president who's already rather unpopular when some of these more unsavory things start getting flagged. That means that, the trade war with Canada is going to become an increasing distraction that Trump will probably want to get out of, just as he would probably take any offer he could to get out of Iran right now that doesn't leave America exposed. So, he's going to want to get out of this. He's definitely looking at a scenario where Mark Carney says, fine, you want to take the auto jobs from Canada, I will blow up the entire auto sector. If we can't have nice things, neither can you. And it feels a little bit like we've got little children on both sides of the border to some extent arguing about this. And as a mom, I want to come in and say, guys need to smarten up because there's people's livelihoods at stake here.
Absolutely. You're absolutely correct. These are very, very high stake talks with a lot of jobs hanging in the balance. Farees, do you agree, though, with Jamie's, kind of prediction about what happens if the Democrats win the White House, that, it might actually be an advantage for the Canadians to wait this out, because things are going to get really, really difficult in terms of the onslaught the Democrats are going to bring to Trump should they prevail, as we all expect in November.
I thought that was really articulately put by Jamie. And I think, the president's basically politically over leveraged right now. And he's going to find himself having to pay back some of that debt after the midterms. My one caution for the Canadian side is that I don't think a President Trump who's rebuked at the ballot box in the midterms is completely, ready to make peace with Canada when it comes to a trade war. I actually think there will be some more throwing some toys out of the pram and getting a bit more spicy with Canada, simply because that will be solely in his executive prerogative to do so. And so the Canadian side has to be, one, prepared to watch how the Democratic investigations and kind of tactics that Jamie was alluding to play out, and be prepared to turn up the temperature in some of those instances. And I also think that the Canadian side is going to have to think very carefully about the stretch between late November into early 2027, and try to create the grounds for an off-ramp that presents a win for Canada, that preserves the integral elements of the NAFTA agreement, but also allows the president to go away and declare victory in a couple of areas that also look like victory for Canada. And that's, to use its phrase, the art of the deal here.
I just want to add one more thing. I think that we're also going to be looking at a court challenge to these 338 Smoot-Hawley tariffs, because they've never been used like this, at least in modern times, and certainly not with an ally that already has a trade agreement in place. So buying for time, Carney might actually get some of these tariffs removed simply by the Supreme Court getting involved.
That's a really good point, Jamie. And then, of course, if you have a Democrat controlled, even if it's just the House of Representatives, how are you going to get that bill passed that enacts those tariffs? Farees brought up Doug Ford, and that's kind of our next topic. Farees brought up Donald Trump not backing down, which reminded me of Doug Ford, which is the complete opposite. When he's faced with some pushback, he often doesn't do that. But he's talking about his favorite topic, which is being Mr. Canada. He had some very spicy language for the president. Brian, Ontario politics, Ontario Conservative politics very, very well. It seems like Doug Ford is back in his comfort zone. Is there a risk, though, that his language maybe crossed the line here, and that this time he's actually hindering our ability to make a deal? Or is this just all going to kind of wash away and it's two grandstanding politicians going at each other?
I don't think there's a risk necessarily like that, Marco. What I think there's a risk of for Doug Ford is to be perceived as getting into somewhat of a childish back and forth with the President of the United States, one in which you're not going to win, and push the United States into, or the president into, doing or saying something that isn't a benefit to Canada, which is very real in this situation, and totally, I would say, not strategic and not very smart. At the end of the day, Carney has done a very good job in how he has handled the situation. And even when Wab Kinew comes out and says something kind of viral, it's still couched within kind of the language and kind of I'm sure doesn't get to the president's attention, but running around on CNBC and CNN and some of these other places trying to get his attention, name calling, is probably not a very positive way for the Premier of Ontario to move forward and put Ontario in the best interest. But at the end of the day, it's inherently apparently popular in the very short term with Ontarians who are angry at Donald Trump, right? Which is what you see with Doug Ford on a continuous basis, whether it's scalpers tickets or trade deals. He tries to jump in at the optimum time to get media, which I think is becoming very risky for him, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think there's a new poll from our friends at Liaison showing that Doug Ford has the PCs have kind of stabilized since the trade talks have gone sour. Jamie, you're like I said, you're in Washington. Does this sort of stuff really, create tension with the White House, or are they most? I know Trump. Called him out by name, made some really, frankly, impolite reference to his late brother. But do you think beyond that, it's really going to have any other impact on these trade talks?
Like, Trump gets into it with certain people that he just decides he really doesn't like. And for various reasons, he really does not like Doug Ford. He actually, I think, liked and admired Rob Ford for a while, just thought he was, kind of entertaining in a way that Trump understood politics and politicians to be. But he really does not personally like Doug Ford. I've heard from folks here in Washington that if Ford opens his mouth, the president's going to get mad. And so we have to keep him quiet if we want any kind of deal with Canada, because he'll just tune it out and he'll start getting frustrated. In this case, I think Ford has kind of led the president into a childish bickering that Mark Carney has wisely stayed out of. And he's come off as the, more grown up person in the room. With when the president is posting and AI videos of Legos making Lake Ontario a Lake America, that's just it speaks for itself. But I do think that when Ford starts using some of the terms and language that he's used, and again, as a mom, I'm not going to repeat the swear word. He really does get the attention of Donald Trump, and it's not the way that we need to get the president to start thinking about Canada as a way to renew talks, to get the tensions to simmer down, to get people back to the table, which we actually really do need to do. And the Americans now know that we're not going to accept a deal unless it's the deal that we already have and is better on our terms. And they know that we'll just keep punching back. And Carney has made it very clear that he's willing to wait out this administration and that Canadians are behind him. So, the president and Doug Ford can get into it together, but that doesn't help Americans and it doesn't help Canadians.
No,
I would just ask Jamie, like, do you see in the US, like from a conservative perspective, there has been a vacuum. We talk about Doug Ford certainly not filling the vacuum in Canada. Who would you say is filling that vacuum in Canada? Like, what are you seeing in the US from the conservative side of it?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I've been watching Shuv Majumdar, talking a lot about the Canada-US relationship. He's really filling that vacuum from the conservative side, and rightfully so. That's his role as a shadow minister for Canada-US relations. And then, there's a lot of different think tanks out there that are like ours, like MLI up north in Canada, that are trying to bring policies and people back to the table. And quite frankly, getting backlash for it, because we're trying to say, like, let's put our elbows down again. This is not helping. And that just, online, you get a wave of enraged anger. Like, how dare you? They're attacking us. And I get that. But you have to remember that there are real people behind these tariffs that are not just going bankrupt because they have to pay for tariffs, but because they can't plan their business. They can't plan, how much their inputs are going to cost. So it doesn't make sense to continue. It makes more sense to shut down and salvage what you can in some cases. And I think that's getting lost in all of the discussion. I understand that Canadians are angry, and you have to understand that Americans are angry too. But the reminding Canadians at the end of the day that, we do have to kind of calm down a little bit and be able to take a deep breath and relax and then come and talk to Donald Trump at some point to solve the situation. So yes, again, I'm really looking to see what, how the opposition plays this, because it is really tough. The country is united behind Mark Carney and his plan. But I think we'll see as time drags on that and people start losing their jobs, and EI is not a job. It is a Band-Aid, that these things start becoming a little bit more risky for the political situation domestically in Canada.
Yeah, and on the Doug Ford front, if it's not just the rhetoric, it does seem, from what I've gleaned from other reporting, is that, he was not happy with the deal that was brought forward to him. And he was saying it was not good enough to get American booze back on the shelves. Now, I'm oversimplifying here, but Ontario is obviously the most important liquor market for the Americans. We're simply the biggest. So I would imagine it would be something where, like, if you're not going to offer that, concession to us, then why are we going to make a deal? So I'm not going to say necessarily Doug Ford axed this deal, but we know that the ads he ran in October certainly played a big role in the implosion of those talks. So at what point, though, that if you're Marc Carney, how do you handle that relationship? Because it's one thing to say, whatever, Doug's going to go mouth off, but if he's actually intervening in those ways that do derail negotiations, how do you balance the thing, knowing that what he's saying, to Jamie's point and to everyone else's point, really is popular and resonating with Canadians? I'll go with you. I'll start with you, Farees.
To some extent, I kind of see the dynamic and the conversations that have been had amongst first ministers, including the dynamic between the prime minister and Premier Ford, as helpful here. It's an example of the federation working in real time during the moment it probably needs to do that the most. I mean, we live in a week where the president of the United States has traded insults with the premier of Ontario and professed his love for Quebecers and French Canadians. I have a hard time in that environment, sort of like making sense of it. But I don't think at all, to kind of get at the heart of your question, Marco, that the premier has been a hurdle to getting a deal done. And I think at various points over the last 2 years, he's played a pretty important role as the leader of one of the provinces most affected by tariffs. On a personal note, you can kind of feel for the guy. There's no question that the president invoking his late brother is kind of like beyond the pale and part of what led to a pretty fiery reaction. But I do think that the premier has since calmed down and is back focused on landing a deal that's good for both sides. It was sort of like seeing another person sort of like subdued and sleepy on TV in the afternoon yesterday. The heart of it for me is it's been an extremely challenging summer for the premier politically. His polling numbers and his popularities were in free fall. It remains to be seen, certainly by me, if that stabilization, Marco, you alluded to, holds the test of time. And there's no question he's sort of looking to put his Captain Canada cap back on and maximize his political gain. I'm not sure how long that's tenable. For me, the big challenge for the premier is to kind of get back to basics, clarify his agenda, and see if he can address some of the economic anxiety that Ontarians are facing.
Mm-hmm. Brian, Farees makes an excellent point in terms of Doug Ford's kind of political calculus. That being said, there's another premier we haven't talked about just yet, Danielle Smith, who seems to be the only one a bit offline with the rest of the messagings we've seen from the other premiers. Even Scott Moe was like, go get him, Marc. Doug Ford seems to be mostly aligned with Marc Carney. When it comes to Danielle Smith, though, does she run any risk within that province of maybe losing some support by being the only premier to necessarily say, yeah, I don't know if I agree going to punch Americans in the chin right now?
Well, I think Danielle Smith has a much tighter rope to walk on than any of the rest of the premiers, especially Doug Ford, whose province is the one arguably the most under attack with the tariffs with the United States. I mean, it's pretty easy for Doug Ford to throw Alberta energy on the table anytime he wants to. He's not the one that has to go to Alberta voters and secure a mandate. Danielle Smith's job is to represent the best interests of the province. And I think that's a much tighter tightrope to walk. You've got the midst of the separation or the referendum on sovereignty. You've got these things coming on. So I think the political calculus for Danielle Smith is far tougher than it is for any of the other premiers that are out there right now. And the comments I'm hearing her say is really what Jamie's talking about, which is trying to take a lot of the passion out of it and the hype out of it and saying, like, we got to get back to the table. We got to figure out what's in the best interest of Canadians, which is a deal with the United States. So I think Danielle Smith's got a tight line here, and I think she's doing her best to walk it while maintaining a fairly high level of support in her province.
Mm-hmm. So great.
Yeah, I would just add to that the Alberta office here in Washington, D.C. and the various Alberta offices throughout the United States are very, very good at what they do. They are extremely well connected, both on the Hill and at the state levels. And so they have a good finger on the pulse of what it is that Americans want and what it specifically Americans want from Alberta. And so they've been able to understand, perhaps in a way that is more educated than some of the other Canadians here, just how to deal with this particular White House, but also this particular Congress. And I'm not saying that Danielle Smith is, everybody thinks she's some sort of right-wing crazy person. She's not. She's not at all down here. She's very well respected. And she has been able to do something that no other premier has really been able to do, which is actually significantly increase the amount of trade that her province does outside of Canada, not just to the United States, but elsewhere as well, and to the extreme enrichment of the rest of the country. Let's not forget that. Alberta is the fastest growing province in terms of jobs in the entire country. And a lot of that is not just because of the energy sector, but there's also lithium, which is something the Americans are looking at, and other mining extractives. I could go on, but Alberta is one of these places where the Americans feel like they can get along with Alberta because they have those relationships. This is something that Canadians really need to invest in. I would just say that, as one of the very few Canadians down here who actually focuses on the Canada-US relationship, I'm actually the only full-time person at a think tank in the United States that focuses on the Canada-US relationship. That's a problem for Canada.
From my perspective, the premier's been a really effective advocate on two fronts. The first is coming with substantive negotiation-oriented suggestions on how the Canadian side ought to handle themselves. I don't think that it's at all unhelpful. In fact, it's quite helpful that the premier said, like, hey, we might want to get back to the negotiating table in advance of this September 8th deadline. I think that's useful. And the one caution I have is, it can be helpful in some of these instances to just let both sides cool off and then get back to it and find the right moment to do that. But I do think it's in Canada's collective interest, and certainly the United States' collective interest, to avoid, $54 billion of tariffs being collectively imposed by both sides. And if getting back to the negotiation table might avoid that, I think that's useful. I do also think that the Premier Smith's been effective at advocating for her province's core economic interest in sort of holding back and keeping people at bay from roping in energy into the negotiations. That's absolutely in her province's interest. My one caution is I'm not sure she's read the national mood totally correctly on how the country is feeling vis-a-vis the U.S. administration and the president totally well in suggesting that we get back to the negotiation table so quickly. I do think she's having to factor for some politics at home.
Absolutely. I want to move to our last topic, which is in the the dynamics within the Conservative Party. Jamil Javani made some comments right after talks broke down, accusing Canada of making things worse with its language, with stress of retaliatory tariffs, saying it would only accelerate the conflict. Once again, it seems as if Mr. Javani's comments are offside with some of the directives of his leader, Pierre Poilievre. Kyle Seaback, one of the Conservative shadow ministers, criticized them on social media, but promptly deleted that post. I know, Brian, I'll start with you. What do you make of the fact that Jamil Javani seems to be differing from the Conservative leadership on this issue?
Well, I don't know why you're going to start with me on that, Marco, but
who knows?
I would say, listen, Jamil Javani doesn't speak for the Conservative Party of Canada. The Conservative caucus has made that clear. Individual MPs are going to go off and do their own thing, whether that's campaign for governors in Florida or go down and visit with the vice president. But I think it's important to note what the leader of the Conservative Party is saying on this, what the critics are saying on this. And, the country is very aligned with Carney's initial perspective on this. At the end of the day, what I find really interesting when you start talking about, and I asked Jamie earlier about the Conservative ecosystem in Canada in regards to this, like you see Jason Kenney being very vocal now, and I think he's generally, as usual with Mr. Kenney, he's had some great points. You see James Moore coming out and speaking more on some of these things. You're starting to see more and more, anytime there's a bit of a vacuum, you see more and more conservative voices starting to fill it. And, I think it's going to be healthy for the center right in this country at the end of the day. But right now, we're in the middle of a trade war, or at the beginning of a trade war, and it's important that everybody is on point, on side, and not going off on their own, whether that's Jamil Javani, Doug Ford, or Premier Eby at the end of the day.
Jamie, I'm curious, do you think, to Brian's point, sure, Jamil is one Conservative MP, and it's not like his views are necessarily being echoed by the leader. But is there this threat that it will overshadow the messaging from the Conservative leadership, specifically because so many people here after the election last year. We're quick to credit Pierre Poilievre's, maybe he wasn't hard enough on the Trump administration is one of the reasons why he lost this election.
Yeah, certainly. I would say that the Jamil discussion is already distracting from the greater discussion, which is where does the Conservative Party stand on all of this? And like I said before, I think Shuv Majumdar is doing a great job of talking about this in public. And I also know he's been talking with some folks down here in DC, not necessarily elected officials, but people like me who are trying to, provide more information and background on what we see happening down here from the Canadian perspective. There's a lot of Canadians down here that are looking up north and going, and conservatives who are kind of going, what are you guys doing? Like, to be frank, I don't know what the Conservative Party's direct position is on all of this, because the knee-jerk reaction to always criticize the Liberal leader is perhaps not always the best one, especially if that's the national mood. And I think that, the tone that folks like Majumdar are taking is probably the better tone to take. But I think it's time that, the Conservative caucus have perhaps a meeting about where Mr. Giovanni's interests lie. And if they are with the caucus, then that's perhaps something he should be reminded of. And if they are not with the caucus, then perhaps it's time he formed his own. I know that's a bit of a thing that nobody wants to hear right now, but he's just not reflecting, I think, the mood of Canada, even the mood of his constituents, on what we need to be doing at the table.
What do you think? Is this a golden opportunity for the Liberals here? Or to Jamie's point, that with Giovanni seemingly offside with what many Canadians and what his own leadership of his own party is saying, is this an opportunity for the Liberals to kind of score some points against Pierre?
I don't think the Liberals think that long or hard about Mr. Giovanni at all. We talked earlier about a tough summer for the Premier. It's definitely also been a tough summer for the federal Conservatives and Mr. Poilievre. I think largely what we're getting at here is an issue that Brian and Jamie identified earlier. There isn't really a clear voice for federal Conservatives being articulate, addressing directly the frustration with the U.S. president and the U.S. administration, and offering a clear alternative in terms of how Canada ought to handle itself right now. I don't think Mr. Giovanni's met the moment or read the moment right, but I don't know that the Conservative Party more broadly has either. In preparing for this, in preparing for our chat today, I sort of listened to an interview Mr. Poilievre gave to the Globe and Mail editorial board about a year ago, so a year post-election and a year ago from today. And he's sort of unable to identify any failures on his part or on the part of his campaign, and he kind of has a back and forth with Globe columnist Andrew Coyne about it. I'm not sure they would be able to look at themselves today and say they've seen any failures in how they've handled Mr. Giovanni today. But the truth is they have, and he has an increasingly large microphone with the public and with the press. I really think that they've got to invite Mr. Giovanni to take a reflection, as Jamie said, on whether or not he sees himself as part of the federal caucus or not. I do think tactically the options for the federal Conservatives are pretty limited, right? They've got to figure out a clear articulation on what they think about the president, not be afraid to use his name, and speak to some of the anxiety and anger that Canadians are feeling. I think they also need to present a plan that kind of meets the moment, and they desperately need to hit the ground running when the House returns, which is going to be a moment where Mr. Giovanni has a pretty big microphone, right? He'll be back on the Hill, the press gallery, Marco, you'll be chasing him down, you'll want to know what he says. And people have to be prepared to give Mr. Poilievre a bigger microphone and to give him things to say in that moment.
What's your take on that? Is this really one of those moments where Giovanni should either get with the program or get out?
Well, this is a critical moment in Canadian history. This is a critical moment to tens of thousands of Canadians that have their jobs and their homes and their families on the line here. And I have seen members of caucus kicked out for far less important times. At the end of the day, it's becoming a test of Mr. Poilievre's leadership as to whether or not he has the strength to be able to get rid of somebody that is so off message and so off brand.
Jamie, I'll give you the final word.
Well, I would agree. I think Pierre's getting a lot of internal tension in his caucus. And if he doesn't start doing something about either asserting leadership in the caucus in a way that caucus will respect and understand, while also making sure that the point of The policy of the party is the policy of the caucus, and that has to be reflected across the board. He's going to continue to get all of these rumors about, discontentment and leadership and floor crossing and all of that stuff. He's got to really, as Brian said, he's got to rise to the moment here and make some hard decisions.
And so for our last segment, we ask all our guests for one thing that they're looking forward to in the week ahead, or something that they're looking back at that maybe got lost in the shuffle in the week that just passed. So I'll start with you, Farees. What are you looking forward to, or what are you looking back at?
Two really important by-elections. We started to kind of, before we came on air, talking about Beaches, East York, three rather, Streaming Shore and North Vancouver, Capilano. I think they're important. I think they're a good litmus test on where the country's at this morning. And I'm really hoping for high voter turnout more than anything. I think it's a moment where people need to be civically engaged, and that counts right now more than ever.
Absolutely. That's a terrific point. How about you, Jamie?
Yeah, I mean, this weekend, hopefully a nice stiff drink, because my life is dominated by tariffs and everything that surrounds it. But I also am hoping to make some time to really do a more deep analysis into some of the primaries that came this weekend, seeing and what that means for the upcoming midterm elections, particularly at the Senate level.
Yeah, those should be some fascinating races. And then finally, Brian, I'll give you the last word.
Well, listen, I think we talked about it earlier. I agree with Farees. The by-elections are going to be really interesting, especially the by-election in Quebec, the results of that, and when the prime minister is going to call the remaining. We are starting to get a lot of by-elections getting piled up here, but there's some really interesting ones. Unfortunately for Conservatives, they all seem to be in formally held Conservative seats, because I know Brantford is another one that will be very interesting to watch as well when that one comes around. So yeah, I think the prime ministers definitely hit the tone and the mark at the right time for these three by-elections. We'll see how the mood of the country goes over the next several months when he has to call I think there's several more by-elections that need to be called.
I think that Brantford one's going to stand out as one of the most fascinating. Like if the Conservatives can comfortably hold it, then that's big news. And I think if they lose it or even come close in terms of that race, like that will be a fascinating one to watch. Jamie, Farees, Brian, thanks for joining us today. For all of you at home, thanks for watching. We'll be back with a new episode each week until as we get prepared for the start of Parliament next month. Thanks all for joining us. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.